Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our third session of our Saturday running series for National Safety Month. My name's Cody Calder. I'm the head of safety at RAAus, and very excited to bring on Jordan Portlock for our presentation on loss of control for pilots this morning. Obviously, loss of control is a great focus of our safety campaign and a very relevant topic, considering it is the number one cause of fatal accident, not only within RAAus operations, but within GA operations worldwide. So I'm sure you'll have some great tips there to take away and some fantastic content from Jordan as well. Before I bring Jordan on in the background, I'd just like to thank our National Safety Month sponsors for supporting RAAus and our safety campaigns. We've got over $10,000 worth of giveaways across the month of October, and by tuning in today, you get an entry into that draw, and we couldn't do that without our sponsors, so we're really thankful to have them on board. Of course, our gold sponsor for today's seminar series is Garmin, who have a range of avionics and a range of products that also aid in safety. And they've got a presentation tomorrow afternoon, so please tune in to check out that range of products as well. But we thank Garmin for the support. Before we get going, if this is your first time joining us for one of our presentations today, on the right-hand side of your page, there will either be a Q&A box, or if there's not, there should be a blue chat box in the bottom right-hand side of your page. If you click that, it should open the panel for the Q&A. Please throw in there all your questions that you have for Jordan, and he will certainly get to those and answer those that he can. These are all fantastic to have feedback and to have your input as well, so please throw some questions in there. So on that note, we'll kick off with our next presentation, and I will bring Jordan into the fold. Good morning, Jordan.
Good morning, Cody. Thank you for introducing me.
No worries at all. Enjoy the presentation, and we'll touch base afterwards.
Thank you. Sounds good. All right. G'day, everybody. Let me just work on sharing my screen. Hopefully that's coming up for everybody. Yeah, perfect. So g'day, everybody. My name's Jordan Portlock. I'm the Assistant Head of Flight Operations for RAAus. And I'd like to welcome you all to this presentation on avoiding loss of control for pilots. A very topical discussion, and we've spent some time yesterday and today talking about some things relating to this, especially with people returning to flying after a potential COVID break. So what are we going to cover today? A number of things. We want to mainly focus on, oh, not sure why it's doing that. We want to mainly focus on, sorry, I'm going to have to sit it there like that for the moment. What we want to mainly focus on is the avoidance and how to avoid a loss of control. But to do that, we need to go into what a loss of control is. So we're going to define what a loss of control is. We're then going to look at some statistics to show you how prevalent loss of control is in the RAAus world, but also worldwide. We're going to look at currency and how currency plays a role in loss of control. Why lighter sport aircraft are susceptible to loss of control. At some point in the future, we're fingers crossed that we'll get an increase in maximum takeoff weight, as we've been holding our fingers for a while. So I want to talk about some of the differences between light sport aircraft and heavier aircraft, and the loss of control that comes with flying a aircraft with a heavier maximum takeoff weight. Loss of control at low airspeeds. and how what are some of the things that we can do to recognise and recover prior to actually having a loss of control, and then some tips to avoid a loss of control after that. So hopefully you can see my screen okay. For some reason it wasn't happy with me sharing. So I might just try it one more time, and hopefully it just stays there. Perfect. So I should have mentioned before, as Cody said, there is Q&A on the side. So if you've got any questions or any comments or anything you want to add, feel free to jump in and do that. And I'll answer the questions and we can have an interactive session, which would be good. So before we get into avoiding loss of control, we want to talk about what a loss of control is. And a loss of control is defined as an occurrence where the aircraft operates outside the normal flight envelope, or when normal control of an aircraft is lost during flight. And there are a number of different ways that RAAus defines them. First of all, it's doing it again. First of all, we've got a loss of control in flight. Excuse me, I'm not sure what's going on there. We've got a loss of control in flight, and then we've got an RLOC, which is a runway loss of control. They're generally the two main forms of loss of control events that we talk about. The first one is at any altitude where something might go wrong. We move outside of that envelope that we talked about before, and we lose control. The other one is runway. Runway can include any time we're on the runway, so it could be takeoff or landing, or any maneuvering we're actually doing on the runway there. And of course, the problem that we've got with that is that we could end up with something that looks like this, which is not ideal at all. No pilot, aircraft owner wants to see their aircraft like this, and of course we don't want to talk about any damage to humans or any accidents that we might have to our bodies in these incidents. So when we're talking about this, just keep this slide in the back of your mind so that you can remember what can actually happen. I also want to talk about some stats at this point. So one of the things, it's important to know why it occurs, but also how often it actually occurs. So over the last 5 years, there have been 127 loss of control incidents reported to RAAus. In that 127, 15 aircraft have actually been destroyed or written off. There's been 46 substantial aircraft that have been substantially damaged, and then 42 that have been minor, that have sustained minor damage. So if the 15 aircraft, there's 15 pilots potentially with their aircraft that they're not going to be able to fly, 46 that are substantially damaged. So it's not only about themselves, but it's also the aircraft and the damage that we can actually do to that. Oh, there you go. Cody's put it up for me. Perfect. That's really good. I was watching a video that I'll recommend you watch, Paul Bertorelli, the other day about stall spin incidents and how he was actually involved in one. That's on YouTube on the AvWeb page. He reckons that there's potentially 1,200 loss of control incidents a year, which is essentially 3 or 4 a day. So they're quite prevalent. So it's really important to talk about some of the things that we can do as pilots to avoid that loss of control. So what do we want to achieve today? Our aim is to educate RAAus pilots about the inherent dangers of operating any aircraft. We talked about the RAAus versus the heavier aircraft before, and we're going to talk about that. And then we want to talk about providing some strategies to prevent these events from occurring. And like I said, it's all about avoidance. So if we need to know what the incidents are and how they occur, and then learn how to, some procedures we can put in place to actually avoid getting ourselves into a position where we lose control of the aircraft. So the big thing to talk about is loss of control is actually preventable. And it's through forums like this throughout the day and through interactions with RAOs and your instructors and watching YouTube and all that sort of stuff that we can become more aware of some of the factors that can potentially lead to a loss of control. And that's the first one on the left-hand side there. It's all about recognition. We need to have good situational awareness to actually be able to recognize these incidents. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on in this presentation about how we actually recognize that the aircraft could potentially be getting towards the end of that envelope and we could maybe lose control of that aircraft. So recognition is really important, knowing what to look out for. The second one in the orange there is correct control actions. We want to make sure, and this comes from our training, but we want to make sure that any time that we get towards the end of that envelope, or if we start to lose control, everything's always fixable. So we want to have those correct control actions. We spent a bit of time yesterday talking about this with our instructor cohort and providing the training to students, the primacy that's involved with that training to get those correct control actions. The last thing we want is to recognize that we're having a loss of control event or it's leading up to a loss of control event, and then provide or input the wrong control actions. So we'll spend a bit of time again a bit later talking about what you can do as a pilot to practice those control actions, so that if you do get into a position where you do have a loss of control or a scenario like that, that you can actually recover from it. Another one is the early decisions, which comes down to aeronautical decision making. And that's the input that comes in of what's actually going on, so the recognition outside, and then making a decision, leading back to the previous one, of controlling the aircraft correctly. So it's about making those decisions. It also talks about making decisions about what is going on before we even get there. So not putting ourselves in a position to actually have those incidents and or accidents. And I can just see in the Q&A that Jill, g'day Jill, thanks for watching. We've got some of the team watching in the background, which is good. Jill's actually posted or popped up the link to Paul Vettorelli's stalling on the base scenario. And it's a really good video to watch, and it talks about complacency and things like that. So I suggest when you finish this presentation, if you've got a bit of time, flick that up. It's about 15 minutes or something, and just watch that. It's really useful. So thanks for popping that up, Jill. So the next one is clear communications, cockpit or crew resource management, whatever the current buzzword is. When you're flying with another pilot, when you're flying with an instructor, it's important to have those clear communications about who has control of the airplane. If there is an incident or an accident, who's actually going to handle that. I should say incidents or accidents, but I said a loss of control or leading to a loss of control. Of course, we want to try and avoid it. So that clear communication. Out of the 127 accidents, I think it was something like 42 of those were conducted or occurred in flight training school aircraft. And that's where the instructor may have been on board, or it might have been a solo student. So clear communications in the cockpit, but also beforehand. And that comes to things like the takeoff safety brief, which we'll touch on later. Excuse me if you can hear, I'm at an airport and there's a helicopter taking off in the background, if you can hear that. But it comes down to the clear communications on the ground prior to making sure we do that takeoff safety brief. making sure we are aware of who is going to be in control of that aircraft is really important. From an instructor point of view, we could have staged and continuing intervention. And it might be when you're flying with another pilot friend as well that you could actually prompt this sort of thing as you're getting towards the end of the envelope or the outsides of the envelope of the aircraft. So it's just a bit of a flow chart there to sort of talk about some of the things that we can do, and we're going to break that down a little bit further later on. Some of the things that we can do to help us mitigate or avoid a loss of control incident or accident. So I mentioned earlier on about pilot currency, and we talked about this, that we had a session earlier on this morning about currency. So if you didn't watch that, we went into currency in a lot more detail. So I suggest you log on to our YouTube channel and have a watch of that. But the best way to avoid a loss of control is to remain current, to continually fly, to continually practice things. We're going to talk about some different types of scenarios later on. Loss of control in training, in a turn, in a go around, engine failure, takeoff, in flight. Another one we often talk about is VFR into IMC. And a lot of those can actually be managed by being current. And once again, very topical at the moment for the pilots, or those of us who have been in lockdown and haven't flown for a significant period of time. It's very easy to think, oh, I'll just go jump back in my airplane and go for a fly. And one of the problems that we can have is we can't remember where that envelope is, or we might go outside the envelope and we might not be able to recover, and we have a loss of control incident or accident. So using the currency barometer on the right, I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but it's just a really good way to make sure that we can remain current or work out where our currency is. And then we can put some steps in place before we go flying to help us out. And they might be reading the POH again, might be doing an engineering questionnaire on the Pilot's Operating Handbook. We talked about earlier this morning about chair flying or sitting in the cockpit and going through your checks. And then it might be going with an instructor and exploring some of these limits so that you can remember where the envelope is for your aircraft. And it's particularly important if you're going to fly a new aircraft or if you haven't flown for a period of time, is going through those steps, the ground-based and the in-flight steps, to make sure that you are current. The more current you are, the better your situational awareness will be. Your cockpit or crew resource management, your aeronautical decision making will also increase, and therefore you'll be able to better recognize and recover from any loss of control incidents that may present themselves to you. So one of the best ways to avoid a loss of control is to remain current. So remember to keep that in the back of your mind. So let's talk about our specific aircraft, our light sport aircraft, and what makes them more vulnerable to a loss of control accident. Now, I know Neil Schaefer, head of training and my predecessor in this role, is very big on this. And g'day, Neil, if you're in the background watching there. But our aircraft are lighter, and therefore there are a certain set of things that can actually make loss of control more prevalent or more vulnerable to the effects of weather and things like that. So you see the list there in front of you. The first one is we've got a lower aircraft weight, which generally means lower inertia. So there's a number of different things we can talk about, and I'll use my list here to go through them in terms of our light sport aircraft. So the lower inertia is a benefit to us in some areas, but also a hindrance in some. So if we think about the go around, and it's something that we often see a lot of incidents, lots of control incidents and accidents in that go-around phase. And that becomes, as we talk about a bit later on, because of that higher power to weight ratio. So we haven't been flying, we'll use a currency scenario from before. We haven't been flying for a while, or we might have been flying a heavier aircraft, and we come back and we hop in a light sport aircraft, which is quite light, but with a lot of power. So a greater, higher power to weight ratio. We decide that we want to conduct a go around, somebody pulls out in front of us, or we're not happy with the approach and we decide to go around, which is a good idea. What we do is we jam that throttle forward, the nose pitches up. As Jill mentioned earlier on this morning, we can have flap out, we can have a certain trim state that's not conducive to the go around, and the aircraft can actually just pitch up, which is not ideal at all. So remembering that as we increase the power, to do it nice and slowly, not jam it forward really quickly. And also just remembering that our aircraft are susceptible to that. They actually have, as we increase the power, the pitch and yaw of the aircraft is often greater than it would be on a slightly heavier aircraft. So because of that and the lower inertia, we can have a reduction in the energy and therefore the speed of the aircraft. So in the go-around phase, it's really important to remember that. But it can make us a lot more vulnerable because of that lower inertia in the go-around phase. Next one I want to talk about is the engine failure and the inertia. So we've got a great spectrum in our fleet of aircraft. We've got aircraft that fly around at 45 knots, and we've got aircraft that fly around at 160 knots. So it's a huge spectrum of the speed range. And also because of that, the inertia of the aircraft. So if we were taking off and we had an engine failure just after takeoff, we need to consider the inertia of our aircraft in terms of a loss of control incident. And because our aircraft are often quite low inertia, we can have a reduction in the energy and a reduction in the speed quite quickly, especially when you take into account, they say something like 4 to 5 seconds of a startle factor when you do have an engine failure or something like that after that takeoff or on the takeoff. So knowing the performance of your aircraft and the inertia is really, really important. And that's something we talked about before in terms of currency, is just practicing, remembering attitudes and things like that. So if something does go wrong, you know exactly what to do in our light sport aircraft. An engine failure in general, engine failure from height or a forced landing can also be impacted by the low inertia. When we're not going to potentially have that energy to push through the air as well as something that might be a bit heavier, and therefore we might not glide as far. Now, some of our aircraft actually glide better than aircraft with a heavier weight, but some of those ones with lower inertia don't. And if you're flying something like a drifter or a thruster or something like that, it's really important to remember that low inertia and how it affects our aircraft in an engine failure. If you've been flying something that's got a greater inertia, you might think you might be able to glide to a certain paddock or a certain area where a lot of the people who have flown the drifters and the thrusters and the Tyros and things like that, the old rag and tube aircraft, know that essentially you're going to land pretty much down below you. So that inertia is really important to remember, because if we don't remember that, we could have a loss of control. We could get to the edge of that envelope as we try and potentially stretch the glide or something like that. VFR into IMC is another one, probably not specifically related to lower inertia, but in terms of our aircraft, if we talk about the rag and tube aircraft that we talked about before, the aircraft that were around when the AUF first started, and they're still around today, which is really good to see. But they don't generally have that much instrumentation. So a flight into cloud or into IMC can often be quite disastrous because they don't have the instrumentation to rely on to get themselves back out of it. The next one is lower approach speeds. So lower approach speeds generally make us more vulnerable. And that's because the gust factor or the wind factor or the crosswind factor or things like that actually make up a larger percentage of our total speed. So if we're coming into land in something that's approaching at 45 knots and we've got a 40-knot wind, we've got a huge, because we've got a lower approach speed, we've got a huge wind or gust factor or things like that that could potentially cause us to lose control of the aircraft. Whereas if we were coming in an aircraft at 100 knots, then that percentage of the gust factor or the wind is going to be significantly less. Also, the size of our aircraft is important. So they're often simpler and lighter weight. The lighter weight means that you can't potentially cut through that air or wind as well as the approach speed that we talked about before. And they're often less robust. Now that's potentially beneficial to us because there's less surface area to be affected by turbulence or wind or gusts or things like that. But also that could also be a bit of a contributing factor because they're not potentially built as well as some of the other aircraft. And that's because the LSA and the amateur built designs are not necessarily tested to certified standard. I shouldn't say that about LSA, but it comes back to the fact that amateur built designs are not necessarily tested towards or at those standards. And then I mentioned the higher power to weight ratio before. Now that's really important to remember in our aircraft, especially if you're a converting pilot. If you're watching this, you just become a member and you're converting over to the RAAus world. You might fly some aircraft, and it can catch you out. So just remembering, we always used to talk about the low inertia, high drag, and that's still very prevalent. But with the increase in the aircraft designs today, it really is about that high power to weight ratio, and it really requires thought and good management. So that we don't get ourselves into a loss of control scenario. Right, I'm just going to have a drink of water and then we'll go on and we'll talk about loss of control with an increased max takeoff weight. So kind of bouncing off some of those ideas in the previous one, as we mentioned before, at some point in time, we're looking to administer a increase in maximum takeoff weight. I know those of you out there watching are very keen to probably work out when that's happening, and we'll let you know when that is happening. But I want to touch on two main topics here. The first one is an aircraft with a heavier weight, so it's maybe like a Cessna 152 or a Piper Cherokee 140 or something like that. Keep them in mind, or a Piper Tomahawk, something with a little bit more weight. And then I also want to talk about a Jabiru, let's say a 230, and the potential to operate it as a 430 up to 700 kilos. So same aircraft that you've been flying, but at a heavier max takeoff weight. So because of them, one of the things that can happen with an increase in maximum takeoff weight is we can get a greater inertia. Now, compared to what we were talking about before, that might actually be beneficial to us in mitigating some of the loss of control incidents and accidents. But it could also be a bit of a hindrance to us. Let's say we were in the landing phase, for instance, and we were so used to flying a light spot aircraft and now we're flying a heavier aircraft. We reduce the power as we come over the threshold, and because of that inertia, we might have been a little bit fast or something like that. We're just going to continue to float down the runway. Runways are only a certain length, and the end of the runway comes up pretty quick when you're going quickly. So that greater inertia can actually be beneficial, but can also be a hindrance to us if we don't take it into account. As I mentioned before, as we mentioned this morning and yesterday, that's where type training is so important, to understand your aircraft that you're going to be flying, especially when you're changing between aircraft, reading the POH and things like that is really important so that you can help mitigate the loss of control events. So if we go through the same list as before, that greater inertia in the go-around is potentially beneficial to us. However, because we might not have the same power-to-weight ratio, we might not have the pitch up and the yaw that we talked about before might not be as prevalent. But because we have a greater inertia, the aircraft's continuing in that downward trend towards the runway, it might take longer to actually conduct the go-around. And that's why you see, if we go really big, we talk about some of the large airlines, 747s, A380s, you can watch videos on YouTube. They actually conduct a go-around. And in the process of the go-around, they actually touch down wheels on the ground. And that's because that inertia, the aircraft is still traveling in that direction. Now, aircraft are not that big, not that heavy, but it is important to recognize that that inertia is greater in an aircraft with a heavier max takeoff weight, potentially, and take that into consideration when you are actually conducting a go-around. It's not going to perform potentially as well as a light sport aircraft. Engine failure from height or a forced landing. If we're used to flying something with a very low inertia, we need to consider that the greater inertia is potentially going to take us further. We might need to come in at a faster speed given the aircraft itself. So that therefore is going to be an addition to the inertia or increase the inertia as well. So we need to take that into account when we are thinking about our loss of control in a forced landing. Once again, like the thing before, we don't want to pick a field and not make it because we haven't thought about that in terms of our forced landing. Engine failure after takeoff, or the takeoff itself, and I'm going to touch on the takeoff itself a bit later, but an engine failure after takeoff with the greater inertia is actually beneficial because we've got a greater inertia, the energy of the aircraft is greater, and potentially will reduce at a slower rate. So therefore, we might have a little bit more time to respond with an aircraft with a higher maximum takeoff weight and greater inertia. In flight as well, the greater inertia might play a part if we are doing a glide approach in the circuit, or we're joining the circuit, we're doing a base turn or something like that. The greater inertia might actually catch us off guard, and we can actually, we might tighten the turn or something because we're used to flying something with a light or less inertia. So we might tighten the turn, and then we can get into the edge of those envelopes for the aircraft, and it can actually cause us problems in terms of the loss of control. VFR into IMC as well. If the aircraft, as they get bigger, they generally have more stuff in them. So it doesn't mean that they're less susceptible to loss of control from VFR into IMC. It just means that there's more information in there to help you try and combat that potentially. It's not always a good thing. If you don't know how to use it, then it's useless. But we can do some training on that to help mitigate. So if we do get into a situation like that, we can actually have a fighting chance of potentially helping or getting out of a loss of control incident. So moving on from inertia, as we said, we've got less power to weight ratios compared to the light sport aircraft, and that's really important to consider. As we mentioned before, especially in the takeoff, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, and in the go around, just to consider that we're not going to be able to get ourselves out of a situation potentially as quick. And just to keep that in the back of our mind, we need to think about that in terms of our aeronautical decision making that we talked about earlier, and doing that a little bit quicker to get ourselves. We'd probably just make the envelope a little bit smaller, I guess. Another thing is the effectiveness in the wind is often better. As we increase the maximum takeoff weight, the size of the aircraft generally increases. We've also got greater inertia as we come in at higher speed. So that percentage of the gust factor that we talked about before is generally better in a heavier aircraft. So that is a benefit in terms of the loss of control there. The last one I want to talk about, and this is quite important, is the performance considerations. If we go back to the two aircraft we talked about before, the 152 or the JE430 upgrade from the 230, we're now got a higher takeoff weight in both instances. So our takeoff is going to be longer. So pilots get complacent. We get very used to, my aircraft is going to take off in this distance. Now we've got a heavier maximum takeoff weight and less power to weight ratio. It'll take a heavier aircraft longer distance or longer time frame to get off the ground. Now, if you're operating from a short strip, that could potentially be disastrous. We can have a loss of control on the runway where we fly into something or hit something like that. We've also got larger rudder, generally on, if the aircraft gets bigger, the rudder generally gets bigger. We've got larger propellers as well, which therefore increase that slipstream, gyroscopic precession, and all those great buzzwords that you would have learnt during your training that we need to consider on the takeoff roll as compared to our light sport aircraft. Landing considerations we kind of touched on before. Heavier takeoff weight is going to, and greater inertia is probably going to increase our landing distance. So once again, we're so used to operating out of a certain strip or aerodrome. Now we've got an increase in weight. We might have a little bit of a tailwind or something like that, and it might just catch us out. So it's really important to have that in our consideration before we go flying about that we might have that greater distance and therefore could lead to a loss of control. We also talked about go-arounds before. The planning of a go-around in something with greater inertia probably needs to be done earlier than in your lighter sport aircraft because of that power to weight ratio. So all in the considerations for landing. And the last one there is the speed considerations. Like I said, they can be beneficial to us with that greater inertia if we have an engine failure after takeoff or engine failure in flight. They might actually be beneficial, but it also might not be. If we're so used to an aircraft with a lower inertia and the speed decay and the energy decay of the aircraft, it can actually catch us out. So when we do move from a light sport aircraft into a heavier maximum takeoff aircraft, or even just flying, you're so used to flying with one person and then you get another passenger on board, the max takeoff weight is going to increase and the aircraft is going to perform differently. So just taking those things into account, that the performance considerations are going to differ, will take you a long way, and adding them into your flight and your flight plan will help you mitigate the risk of or avoid a loss of control incident or accident. So they're the potential differences between light sport aircraft and aircraft with an increase in maximum takeoff weight. Not seeing many questions there. Hopefully I'm not boring you too much, but if you do have any questions or any comments or something, feel free to put them in there and we can discuss them as required. But now we want to talk about the loss of control at a lower airspeed, and hopefully you can actually see all of that there. So the aviation consumer, which is part of ABWeb when investigating loss of control incidents, came out with this statement. So pilots must be current in the aircraft type, as we talked about before, really important, and they should practice management of the aircraft at slow speed at a safe height. We talked about that in currency this morning, and we talked about that yesterday as well, and we'll touch on that again, but doing it at a safe height is really important so that you can understand and explore that envelope of the aircraft with yourself or an instructor, as it mentions next, without having the risk of being close to the ground. So as I say, take an instructor with the pilot if you're not current to practice managing the aircraft in slow speed in the landing or takeoff configurations at height, and effective use of rudder to control the aircraft during the landing or the takeoff. So some really important points there that I want to touch on in a minute. The important thing to remember, whether you're flying, no matter what aircraft you're flying, is when we're at a slow speed, the controls react differently. Comes back to what you first did in your TIF and then your effects of controls lesson, which for some of us might be recently and some of us might be a long time ago. Just to remember that the effective airspeed and energy of the aircraft, if you like, the controls will react differently when we actually get into those scenarios. So what's actually going on? It's important to understand what's going on. It's important to understand at what point the ailerons change during reducing airspeeds. So because we actually, with the reduced airspeed and reduced energy, we've got less airflow over the ailerons. Therefore, you're going to have to make larger changes, potentially a yoke or a stick, to actually get the same input. But as we get to a slower speed, the effectiveness of those ailerons is actually going to reduce. So it's really important, once again, by yourself or with your instructor, to explore that envelope, go up to altitude 3,000, 3,500, depending on your ground level around your area, and actually explore that. Let's reduce the airspeed. So if our normal cruise speed's 90 knots, come back to 70 knots, and then 65, and then 60, and all the way back to the point of the stall, to understand what our ailerons actually do and their effectiveness as we reduce that airspeed. And that'll be really important when we're trying to get out of loss of control incidents. And actually knowing this stuff will help avoid a loss of control scenario. The next one is be familiar with the increased control deflections, as I mentioned before, and that's in all of our primary controls in ailerons, elevator, and rudder. We can take that further. We're not just 3-axis organization, as you know. We've got 2-axis aircraft, our weight shift microlights, and our powered parachutes as well. And they act slightly differently, but it's still really important to understand how and be familiar how we need to increase that control deflection. And it might be with a yoke or a bar or toggles, but it's really important to understand that when we reduce that speed, our control deflectiveness is actually greater at the slower speed. Back to effective controls as well, and your TIF is to know how to use the secondary effective rudder. So the secondary effective rudder, as we know, is roll. And when the ailerons become less effective, we can actually use the rudder to help us gain some roll movement. So it's really important to actually start to correlate that rather than just thinking, oh, I need to use the aileron. Let's use a coordinated effort of aileron and rudder, especially when we're going slow, especially when we're coming into to a landing. So go up to altitude once again and just practice that. With the reducing airspeed, look at the effect of the aileron, as we mentioned before, but also look at the effect of rudder and the secondary effect of rudder. Really important to do. Next one is power. Power can be your friend. It's obviously as we increase power, we get that pitch and yaw, which is not ideal when we're at a slow speed if we're not managing it correctly. But it can increase the airflow over on a conventional aircraft with a tractor aircraft with a engine out the front, and pusher aircraft in some cases. We actually get the increased airflow or slipstream over the elevator and the rudder. So we get more control effectiveness. But just be ready for the side effects we talked about before. The increase in power to weight ratio, the pitch up and the yaw and things like that can potentially be disastrous in terms of loss of control at a slow speed. So remember, power is your friend, but just make sure you're ready and you understand the side effects of it. And the last one on this page is that the sink rate changes as the airspeed decreases. So as our airspeed decreases, generally our sink rate will increase. So know when this happens. Once again, go up to altitude, put your aircraft in a descent, and slowly raise that nose, reduce the airspeed, and see what happens to that rate of descent as you actually do that. So it's all about understanding what your aircraft does at the slow speed, which will give you the best tools possible to help you avoid a loss of control. Also understand what's happening when you're coming into land, when you're getting closer towards the ground or towards that runway. We know that conditions change closer to the ground. And the second point there talks about wind gradient and how that actually affects our aircraft in terms of our sink and rising on the approach, and also potential increases in rate of descent. A lot of the times we'll see that we'll get an increase in rate of descent as we approach close to the runway, and that can catch people out. We can have hard landings, obviously a form of loss of control. We could also try to mitigate that. We have a go around or something like that. At that point, we don't effectively manage the go around. So the wind gradient is a real effect that's really important to anticipate on the final approach. And that depends on the different aerodrome you're operating from, but it's really important to understand that. And that goes on to my third point there about local topography, buildings or vegetations, and how they directly affect the airflow or the wind closer to the ground. We could have mechanical turbulence, which could, from the topography or buildings, it could increase that wind gradient. So not only understanding what the aircraft is doing, but understanding the environment around us is really important. So we're going to go through some quick good practices because in loss of control events, your life depends on it. So pilots must be current in the aircraft type. It's really important to go through that type training, keep reading the information in your POH, and understand the aircraft so that you know where those envelopes are. As we mentioned before, practice slow speed landing or takeoff configurations at height. Practice that stuff. Go up there where there's no risk of coming into contact with the ground, and practice. See what the aircraft does. So go up there and practice those slow speed and takeoff configurations. Also use the rudder. The rudder is one of the most effective but misunderstood controls that we have, especially when we talk about the secondary effects of rudder that we can actually use to benefit us in the approach phase. But go up to a height and actually work on your rudder usage, coordinated controls, not coordinated controls. Look at slipping and skidding, turning, just using the rudder alone, things like that, to better understand your aircraft and understand the effect that the rudder has is really important. And then if you're not current, comes back to the currency thing we talked about before and this morning, take an instructor with you. You're always going to learn something, hopefully, when you take an instructor. Take an instructor with you and just explore some of these things, especially back to point one, if you're not current in the aircraft. So take an instructor with you. Conduct your flight review early. Do a BFR a little bit earlier to help avoid it. BFRs or flight reviews are required every 2 years, but it doesn't mean you have to do them every 2 years. You could do them every 12 months. You could do them every 6 months just to provide yourself some assurance. Every time you do a new type endorsement or certificate on the aircraft, then you can use that as a flight review. Go and do an endorsement to expand your horizons and expand that envelope that you operate in is really important. And of course, we're working on some upset recovery stuff at the moment. Go and fly in a CASA aircraft or a glider GFA aircraft where you can actually exceed those envelopes. Look at the upset recovery, look at spins and stalls in different configurations. Really important to work out where that envelope is. And in those aircraft, you can actually do that and exceed the envelope and work out how to actually recover from them. So that's another good tip there with your instructors. So has this happened to you? What can go wrong? The approach is not planned for the conditions. The conditions always change. We need to make sure that we understand that and are prepared for that. If we're not stabilized, we need to have a stabilized approach. If we're not stabilized, let's go around. Really important. We're not using the rudder for directional control. That's also really important. So use your rudder and understand why it's actually there. One of the things when we talk about stalls is actually going up and practicing the stalls and not using ailerons. As we know, when we use ailerons at the point of the stall or following the stall, it can actually make it worse. And so that's one of the things that can actually go wrong. Going up and practicing just with your stick, just forward and back, and not using any ailerons or any moving the wing when you actually do it. Overuse of brakes before the aircraft is settled. That's something that can happen, and a bounce is not actually recovered, and pilot-induced oscillations can occur. Couple of comments there. Anjum, g'day Anjum, thanks for commenting. An important phase, especially in the J230, is when going around with full flaps. It generally tends to pitch up suddenly and yaws to the left. If it's not corrected, it can cause a stall and potential spin to the left. So a bit of a war story there from Anjum. Thanks for that. As I said, really important to understand the high power to weight ratio, the low inertia of our aircraft, and actually practice that stuff and be aware that if we do go around or in any phase of flight, that we can actually have a potential incident and be prepared for it, understand it. And g'day Lloyd, one of our CFIs calling in. So thanks for watching. On aircraft with long wings, down aileron application at slow approach speed produces greater adverse yaw. That's very important. So appropriate rudder is also really important to be applied together with the aileron to maintain directional control. And that's, really good point, Lloyd. Adverse yaw in our aircraft that are high drag and potentially low inertia as well. We really need to make sure that we understand that rudder to help mitigate the effects of adverse yaw and adverse aileron yaw. So thanks for your comment there, Lloyd. That was really good. I'm going to show a quick video. Maybe no, it's not going to come up. All right, here we go, Cody, talking about pilot-induced oscillations.
Fuck it.
Great, thanks for that, Cody. So back to this slide, we talked about pilot-induced oscillations. You've probably seen that video before, very famous and common video. In that instance, to avoid it, we can conduct a go-around. But you can see it's very common, very easy to do when we bounce to get into those PIO situations. And that's why having that thought process in your mind will really help to prevent an incident like that. Whereas if it does start to, we do start to fight against the aircraft and the PIO does develop, that we go, right, as soon as it happens, we're going to go around, we're going to get out of there. So really important thing to do, and good to watch that video there. Neil Sidwell, g'day Neil, thanks for commenting. Are RLs any closer to allowing VFRs to take place anytime during the renewal month like GA do? Yes, Neil, that's something we're actually working on. That's a really good point. In the new or next Ops manual update, we're going to have a look at something like that because you're right, there's no real safety benefit to keeping it 2 years. We can actually go to the end of the month. So that's something we will be looking at, not necessarily to align ourselves with CASA, but it just makes more sense, especially when people have the dual RLs and CASA pilot's license certificate or instructor ratings. So thanks for your comment there, Neil. We're running out of time, so good picture there. I'm going to skip over that. You can see what can actually happen, and we looked at that before, and this is obviously what we want to try and mitigate. So a couple of golden rules. What can we actually do? And we talked about avoiding. So we've looked at so far what loss of control is, the difference between low and high speed currency, and then low and high takeoff weights, light sport, maximum takeoff weight with an increase. So now we want to just talk about some of the golden rules and tips to help you stay safe and avoid the loss of control. So the first one there, in strong winds, approach speed should be varied as the conditions dictate. So when we get a really strong wind, we can have the best glide speed plus potentially 1/3 of our wind speed, and that'll help increase the inertia of the aircraft and actually cut through some of that wind that's going on. And that's really important to help us. It also provides a bit of a safety buffer over the potential stall if we increase that speed and cut through that air. When we're coming into land, something we talked about heavily yesterday is the rudder controlling the runway alignment, or the alignment with the center line, and the ailerons controlling any slip or the approach there. And having a stabilized approach, really, really important. Go out and practice your approaches. We talked about that in currency this morning. Practice those approaches. Have a stabilized approach, and go out and practice maintaining that center line, looking at the flight tolerance as well that we talked about this morning. Expect the conditions to change. Expect that the conditions are always going to change. Expect the unexpected. If we can start to think about it and start to plan, it's going to make our life a hell of a lot easier when something does change. And it'll help with our aeronautical decision making. Our situational awareness will increase as well. So really important to expect the conditions to change. Based off of that, we can plan the approach based on the threats. On a really windy day, we've got the threat of the wind. We've got a lot of traffic around. We might be distracted. So plan the approach based on the threats that we actually have. Professional pilots go around when any doubt exists. Whenever I'm training my students, I talk about if someone pulls out in front of you, if someone tells you to, if you're flying at a controlled towered aerodrome, if they tell you to, somebody, if you're not happy, or if you get a bit of an itchy finger, at least just go around at any time there is any doubts, conduct the go around. Much better to do that. No one will ever penalize or criticize you for going around. So conduct that go around and try again when you've got a more stabilized approach. Understand your aircraft and how it handles differing airspeeds. Go up to that altitude and just play around. Explore that envelope. See what it does. Whenever you get into a new airplane, same thing. Go and explore the control effectiveness throughout that speed range. Have a look at stalls. Have a look at forced landings. Have a look at engine failures after takeoff. Understand how the aircraft actually responds. And that's one of the best ways to know how to avoid the loss of control is what the airplane is actually going to do in those scenarios. Practice, practice, practice. Go out and practice. We talked about before, a lot of people don't like doing circuits, but go and practice circuits in a variety of conditions so that you understand your limits. And that's something we haven't talked about, but talking about your limits given the conditions as well. Get an experienced instructor who can develop your flying. Instructors are always happy. They love imparting their knowledge, always happy to fly with you. So even if it's just a couple of circuits, just grab an instructor and go out and have a bit of a play. They can develop your flying, give you things to work on. It's always good to have goals and things to work on and always learn stuff from our instructors. As you mentioned before, complete type training. Keep reading the POH. I know the POH is not the be-all end-all, but the manufacturers wrote it because they're the ones who actually flew and designed the aircraft. And so if we operate to those set of rules, it'll definitely help us in avoiding a loss of control. Do regular BFRs, as I mentioned before. Do endorsement training. Continue that learning cycle and get someone to help check you. Do some chair flying, especially when we're coming out of COVID. Do some chair flying in a variety of different scenarios and conditions, and take safety seriously. Understand all this stuff. Go up and practice. Don't just go for a fly around just for fun, which is obviously what we want to do. But on occasion, go up and explore that envelope and really understand your aircraft and take that safety seriously. So there's some golden rules or some tips. So that brings us to the end. Hopefully you've learned some stuff about avoiding and some tips and tricks, tips and tricks, if I can say it, on actually avoiding loss of control, why it happens, and some things that we can do in our different aircraft to avoid it. But I want to leave you with one final statement. I did a course this week and I took this from this course. Things go wrong because they usually go right. Let's look at what makes us successful and learn the lessons from them. When we go out flying, let's talk about what we usually do right. If something goes wrong, what did we do differently? Let's learn from what we usually do right. I thought that was really good because we usually focus on the negative. Let's focus on the positive and learn from that. If you've got any other questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A or give us a call or send us an email or something. Hopefully you found this beneficial. Yeah, I guess if I was to summarize, just think about all the things that can actually go wrong, learn about your aircraft, learn about yourself, and the more that you can do, the more that you can practice, the better prepared you will be to avoid a loss of control. National Safety Month stuff is up on our website as well. So jump onto our website and there's a lot of good stuff about loss of control and tips to avoid loss of control on there. So thank you for listening to me ramble on for the last hour. Hopefully you've learned something and I'll hand back over to Cody.
Not a ramble at all. Thanks so much, Jordan. That's a fantastic session. And I threw up a poll throughout that session just asking who's experienced a loss of control or nearly experienced a loss of control. And about 70% of those people that responded have been in that circumstance or nearly been in that circumstance. And I'm sure many of us have also been close to a loss of control without even realizing that we've been there as well. But yeah, some really key tips that I took away there, particularly around being prepared for a go-around. We see so many aircraft damaged or destroyed in landing accidents that could have been avoided by an earlier decision to go around. And really going out and fully understanding the characteristics and handling of your aircraft. And if you're not comfortable to go and expand that understanding and you know, find where the edges of that are, take an instructor with you and really understand how they perform. We do, as mentioned, see a lot of accidents in this space. It is also the cause of 2/3 of our fatal accidents over the last 5 years. So a really serious topic and a great presentation there. So thank you very much, Jordan. The only other thing I'll quickly mention is just manage distraction as well. And for our pilots out there who might be doing a certain type of operation, they might be flying around their farms and looking out the windows. It's often that distraction that leads to not detecting that the airspeed's decreasing, that you're increasing the angle of a bank and a turn around a point. And that's where we see loss of control events happen as well. So lots of fantastic tips. So thanks so much for joining us, Jordan.
Thanks for having me, Cody.
No worries. Alrighty, so that brings us to the end of Jordan's presentation this afternoon now. Just before we wrap up, I'd like to thank again Garmin, who's our gold sponsor, sponsoring today's presentations, and you can check out their products in a presentation that we've got tomorrow afternoon. Of course, National Safety Month wouldn't be possible if it weren't for all of our sponsors, and we've got over $10,000 worth of giveaways throughout the month, and we really, really do thank them for their support. This afternoon, we've got a few more presentations coming up. We've got AMSAR joining us at 12:45 with some information about their search and rescue efforts, as well as some information on PLBs, which are really handy from a safety perspective for our pilots. We've got Jill coming back later, our head of flight operations, to look at safety at CTAFs and elucidate and avoid some of our near-miss accidents that we see. And join us later as we welcome a couple of the Bushflyers Down Under crew to look at bush flying and some of the do's and don'ts and safety considerations there. Tomorrow, again, we have another full list of seminars, so please do join us back there tomorrow, including Garmin and a bunch of other guests that will be joining us through the presentation slots there. Once again, we thank you for participating and being part of National Safety Month, and we hope to see you back at our next session. Thank you very much.
Stop.